be reserved.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 28th annual summer celebration of the Aspen Institute. There are so many to thank. Our advancement team, our Society of Fellows, our trustees, many of whom are here today. I'd like to especially convey our gratitude to our underwriters, and if I could ask you to hold your applause until the end. Mercedes Bass, Jackie and Mike Bezos, the Crown family, Bonnie and Ken Davis, Ann Welsh McNulty, Diane Morris, Hala and Sammy Munainai, Carrie Walton Penner and Greg Penner, Margot and Tom Pritzker, and the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund. Thank you all.
Is that a butterfly?
Well, we have a visitor here. Tonight, we come together for dialogue about the history, dynamics, and possible destinies for our ever-changing multicultural democracy. We are honored to welcome and celebrate the historians Annette Gordon-Reed and Jon Meacham, both of whom embody values-based leadership through their scholarship and citizenship. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is the recipient of the Institute's Public Leadership Award. She is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University, a Pulitzer Prize winner and National Book Award recipient. She has helped change the discourse on the founding of America and brought a clarifying lens to so much of our history and the structures of racial injustice in our country. We are equally proud to present Jon Meacham with the Institute's Public Service Award. Jon is one of the most influential historians of our times and a winner of the Pulitzer Prize as well. His books cover themes from the founding of America to the Civil Rights Movement to the history of American music and more. Our moderator this evening is Scott Simon of NPR News. Scott is one of America's leading writers and broadcasters. He is the host of the Weekend Edition Saturday. He's one of the hosts of NPR's morning news podcast, Up First. He's reported from all 50 states in 5 continents, from over 10 wars, from El Salvador to Sarajevo to Afghanistan and Iraq. His books have chronicled character and characters, war and peace, tragedy and comedy, sports and art, and more. Thank you to the 3 of you for being here today, and Scott, take it away.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here, and particularly with these 2 great historians and Pulitzer Prize winners. I want to take a few moments at the top tonight. There are a couple people we have to remember. I would like to hold a thought tonight for Salman Rushdie. I think the saddest words I have read this weekend where Salman Rushdie is on a ventilator and cannot speak. Salman Rushdie cannot speak. I don't think I need to talk about the way in which what's happened to him exemplifies a kind of virus that has been let loose around the world, and as he says, has said for years, the best way to defeat terrorism is not to be terrorized. I've been blessed to interview him and meet him on a couple of occasions. There was a story that just kept repeating itself when I heard the news, and we had just interviewed Marianne Wiggins, the novelist to whom he was once married, great novelist, and who had been underground with him in those early years. And my family and I ran into him a few years ago at the Los Angeles Times Book Festival. And for some reason, this will make the people at the Aspen Institute reevaluate whether or not I should be any kind of moderator. I said to Salman Rushdie, you know, Mr. Rushdie, our daughters have named their betta fish after you. Salman Fishty. And he got a look on his face, and I thought, oh boy, have I gone over the line. And then he said, and this fish, does he write much? And I said, no, Mr. Rusty, he doesn't, because he's in water and the ink just dissipates. And he says, well, good. Tell him to keep it that way. It's much safer. So I want to hold a thought tonight for Sam and Rusty. And I think writers around the world who, I don't mind saying, have to live in fear. Many who are behind bars. Many old high school friend of mine, Carlos Era, who won the National Book Award years ago for a great book called Dreaming of Snow in Havana, pointed out when he got the National Book Award that he would have been put in jail there just for writing the book. Not publishing it, just for writing it. And there are writers all over the world who have to contend with that. And of course, we want to remember David McCullough, who received the Public Service Award that Jon and Annette received tonight. He made figures from some of the backbenches of history. We can forget when he wrote about John Adams. Adams was considered to be almost the least glamorous member of the founders at that point, but he let us glimpse inside his heart and the extraordinary quality of his mind. When he wrote about Harry S. Truman, no period, right? It was just, yeah, no period. Hardly as glamorous as FDR or JFK, not the war hero that Ike was, but he made a series of stunning and far-reaching decisions following World War II. High school education, haberdasher, not a descendant of the Mayflower, but of the Prendergast political machine. And yet he made a number of important and far-reaching decisions. So to bring us to Jon and Annette, Jon has vivified the lives and pictures of our currency, warts and beauty marks and all. He's reanimated voices from the civil rights movement and other individuals who merit, I think, being called America's founders in the civil rights movement as much as anybody who signed the Constitution or the Declaration. And now, of course, his latest book will be on the great visage of Lincoln. And Annette, who has brought the lives of Americans who've been missing from much of our history to life, living and breathing as human beings and creative human beings, the Hemings family and more. They have both nourished our history and our understanding of America with sweat and with understanding. So thank you both for letting me join you here today. Annette, you didn't come to write history with the background of a historian, but of an attorney. Tell us how that took you down the path to look into the Jefferson-Hemings line.
Well, I started out as a law professor, and I was supposed to be writing a law review article, which I was not very interested in. And I read some articles, this is like 93, 94, about a movie that was going to be made about Jefferson in Paris. And there was outrage because the movie was going to treat the story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings as if it were true. And there were people coming on and saying, in editorials and so forth, this is awful. We know this didn't happen. There's no evidence that this ever happened. And I knew from my readings, because I'd always had an interest, long had an interest in Jefferson and Monticello and slavery, I knew that there was evidence. It may not have been evidence, it may not have been proof, but there was evidence. And to say that Madison Hemings, who gave a recollection in 1873 saying he was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, I knew that that was evidence. And whether people believed him or not, that should be considered. And I felt it was really insulting to say that a person who had been enslaved, who tells you what happened during slavery, that we don't have to listen to them. And it was mainly historians believing Jefferson's white family and their story about why all of Sally Hemings' children looked just like Jefferson, that they were the children of his nephew and one of his nephews. And I decided, and also I noticed that historians would very often say, if this were in a court of law, the burden of proof, and they were throwing around these legal terms, and I thought, well, this is a perfect exercise for me as a law professor to talk about this problem the way we talk to our students. Here's a controversy, here's a story, here's one side says this, the other side says that. let's weigh the evidence and look at how historians had done it. And I had found that historians were putting a thumb on the scale for Jefferson and his legal family while ignoring what the other people said. So this was me as a law professor taking historians to task for the way that they were viewing evidence. That was my first book in 1997. And then the following year, they did the DNA testing on descendants, and it corroborated what I said in my book. And that's essentially how I became a historian, from a law professor. I mean, I always read history, and I majored in history at Dartmouth, and I always loved history. But I went to law school because I thought it was more practical at the time. I don't know that it's true, but I mean, it worked out. Well, actually, I had been told that there were too many PhDs in history. But what I didn't know was that there were not very many black PhDs in history, and people would have been happy if I had done it. But, you know, it's worked out. So that's
Yeah, I think it has. I think you're good.
Yeah. Jon Meacham, not
Yes,
to
sir.
put you on the spot, you were among a group of historians who had lunch with the President of the United States the other day. I think I will bespeak the curiosity of a lot of people in this room when I ask, what did you have for lunch?
Well, NPR's fact-checking needs to work. It was not lunch. It was actually just a meeting. It was off the record. Annette and I have done these together in the past.
I mean, excuse me, not even like some guacamole and chips?
No.
COVID.
Yeah.
It was
right.
The president was kept testing positive. Given the week he had, get COVID again.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this was an amazing week for the good guys. I
know it was off the record, but you can.
It was yes. Okay. I think Annette would. So you can back me up on this. The president is deeply interested in the American story. He's deeply interested in the kinds of things we write about and talk about. He is when you think about it, he's actually the most politically experienced American president since 1789. Right? 36 years in the United States Senate, 8 years as vice president. It's not even really close.
Not close.
And so he's lived a huge chunk of this history. And like most of the folks who end up in that chair, they understand that there are two kinds of time. There's history time, and there's Twitter and cable time. And let me tell you which one you want to prefer. And so he's my friend. I help him when I can. You should know that.
You worked on a speech, right?
Yes.
According to reports, yeah.
Yes. And the friendship began, I'll just tell you, actually, it's what every writer wants. He read a couple of my books and he called me. And basically, given my demographic, that's about the age of the person who does call me. So that's good. Beschloss and I have a bet at what point will books we write go straight to large print. So Annette's got the TikTok kids, but we don't. So he had read a book I did on religious liberty some years ago, and then a book I did 4 years ago now called The Soul of America, which was an attempt to talk about the contention between light and dark, between the worst impulses in the American soul and our better impulses, and what a close-run thing, as Wellington said of Waterloo, it is to come out on the right side of that. And so yes, we talk a good bit, and I'm honored to do it. And I think he's trying very hard in the most politically polarized hour since the 1850s to lead this difficult, complicated, imperfect experiment into a place where it can go on. And what I would suggest to everyone who has doubts about the experiment, what would you replace it with? All right? So he gets criticized sometimes for being too conventional. Again, I recommend the legislative record of the last week. And if you look at the way he's trying to govern, it is not perfect. But presidential politics is not a referendum. It's a choice. Nobody came to the country in 2016 and said, hey, do you want the guy who became the 45th president? I'm not going to mention Voldemort until Scott does. Do you want him to be president? That wasn't the question. The question was, do you want him or Secretary Clinton? And the result was what the result was. In 2020, the question was not, do you want Joe Biden to be president? It was, do you want President Biden, Vice President Biden, or do you want the incumbent? And one of the remarkable things about American political life is we spend an enormous amount of time, and emotional, financial, cultural, on presidential elections. And then about 20 minutes after they're over, we forget about the other person. Most of the time. Yeah, this is an exception, as ever. So I would just argue that you all are opinion leaders. You are important citizens. All citizens are important. You are particularly so. When rendering a judgment on contemporary politics, I think there's a lot of good to be had in pausing just a second and thinking about it. Thinking about this, what is this going to look like in 6 months or 6 years? People like me always want presidents to govern for 25 years and not 25 weeks. But I would argue that given the forces in contention at this hour, that is particularly important. Last thing quickly, when I'm honored to give commencement speeches, which is great fun because the kids are hungover and they're paying no attention. So I'm really speaking to the grandparents and the parents. A line that has never failed to get a reaction is, I say, when you're thinking about Twitter and you're thinking about the means by which we offer social opinions, just because we have the means to express an opinion quickly does not mean we have an opinion worth expressing quickly.
Let me ask you about history. Do we still, despite our best efforts and your extraordinary efforts, sometimes see history as a story of particularly distinguished and huge personages, as opposed to people who occupy different strata of society and who really make history?
Well, I think it's changing now. I mean, there's certainly the market for great man history is there. You write about Jefferson, you write about Adams, or Lincoln, or whatever, there's a set market for that. But the interest in people who are not at the top, or who were not at the top, is really strong. I mean, if you go to Monticello, the plantation Monticello now, it's not just about Jefferson, it's about the hundreds of people who lived there, probably spent more time total than he spent there, given how often he was away in public life. Podcasts, there's so many different ways of getting history now, and that are history podcasts are really important, and they're very often about the people who are history from the bottom up. So I think it's really changing. I think that there are people who don't like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you may have heard a few weeks ago there was an attack on Monticello. The people saying all you're talking about is the bad things, and it's really not
like
that.
a Yelp review or something.
Yeah, well, no.
Or it sounded like a Yelp.
Well, it sounded like a Yelp review, except it was supposed to be this ordinary citizen who went to Monticello, but he really wasn't. He's a very political person who went there and made this complaint, and there's going to be pushback because people want the old stories, like you tell your kid stories at night, and if you skip anything, wait a minute, you skip something, you have to go back and tell it exactly the same way. Well, history shouldn't be like that, like a bedtime story. there is room for a broader and a more inclusive picture, because even in writing about Jefferson, the Hemingses of Monticello is a story of the family of the Hemingses, but it's also in a way sort of a biography of Jefferson, because it's the people around you. We are who we are, but we are who we are in relationship to other people. And if you don't know those other people, you don't really know him.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is a market for that.
One of the many things that I've admired in your writing about the Jefferson and Hemings over the years is that you discourage the idea that Sally Hemings was just a victim, that she really made choices that helped her children in a way that maybe we need to understand.
Well, I mean, they were in France, and the important thing is that African-American people, when they had any opportunity to use law during slavery, they did that. They did whatever they could to try to make their lives better. And being in France with him, she and her brother had an opportunity to be free and stay there. And the story that Madison Hemings tells is of her extracting a promise from him that any children she had would be freed. Their children would be freed when they're 21, and she would have, a nice life at Monticello. And that was a gamble. It was a huge gamble. And it's tough for us because the first time I was writing about this, and people ask me very often, why would she make that choice? How could you, he could do anything, come back. He could not fulfill the promise or whatever, but life is risky. And I think for women at that time period, the risk was attaching yourself to a man and hoping that he would treat her right. And that's the way women lived. It was not as though there were lots of other options, lots of other things to do. But I really wanted it to be important. I thought it was important for me to make the point that she understood the law and used the law in a way that ended up being beneficial for her. Slavery ended in her family line when her children left Monticello. This is 40 years before other African-American people were freed.
Let me ask you both. Should Jackson be on our currency?
Oh, wow.
I believe, let me say one thing. Can you imagine, and Annette, my wife has read one nonfiction book twice, none of which I have authored. She's read The Hemings of Monticello twice because she liked it so much. So it's kind of a source of domestic strife. And Annette is particularly annoying because she's not only arguably the most brilliant person I know, she's also really nice, which kind of pisses me off. So there's that.
Really not fair.
But imagine Sally Hemings negotiating with one of the most powerful men in the world. She was 15, right? 16, 15, 16. It's just sit with that for a second.
Well, you think about law, the importance of law, which is what makes where we are now so scary. People thinking that rule of laws don't matter, and rules do matter. And she understood that, and she knew how he felt about it because he believed that the law was on her side, and he abided by that. So, yeah.
It's amazing. Jackson.
Hear this.
Can I tell you a quick story? That's about 3 of my favorite topics. It is a true story, unlike a lot of what I... Anyway, so it's about Andrew Jackson, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Donald Trump.
They all walk into a bar?
And there's one parachute. No, this is a true story. So in March of 2017, President Trump announces that he's coming down to Nashville, where I live, to speak at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's house. And so I was sitting at home thinking I should do something. So I'm a Jackson biographer. So I wrote an open letter to the president saying, "Dear Mr. President, welcome, delighted you're embracing history. But if you're going to embrace Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts." Right? And there are plenty of crazy parts of Andrew Jackson to embrace. He once said that his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and shot John C. Calhoun, his own vice president.
Could be inspirational, I think.
Yeah. I didn't foresee all the implications of pointing that out. Anyway, so and in a very kind of bold, I think, move, I sent it to the local newspaper, and it was the entire front page of the Nashville Tennessean that day, and I had no effect, whatever, of course. The next day, true story, I'm walking into lunch, and my phone rings, and it's George Herbert Walker Bush. And he said, "How you doing?"
It's pretty good, isn't
As
it?
Dana Carvey once said, the key to doing the old man's voice was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. He said, I said, "I'm fine, Mr. President. How are you?" He said, "I'm fine." He said, I read your letter to Jackson, and I thought, oh, shit, the old boy's losing it, right? He thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. And so I said, "Thank you, Mr. President. Actually, that was a letter to Trump about Jackson." And without missing a beat, George H.W. Bush said, "Yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention."
Oh!
And then he hung up. He had thought of the joke. He wanted to do it. And he said, "See, that was it." My view of Andrew Jackson, which is not that far from my view of Thomas Jefferson, is that in many ways his sins are the nation's sins. His shortcomings are the nation's shortcomings. And I think we have to resist, in many ways, a beguiling and seductive path which would lead to, if we remove someone from a national narrative, somehow or another, we absolve ourselves of the sins of then and their ongoing wages. And so I don't care who's on the $20 bill. Honestly, my test for these things is, were you devoted to the journey toward a more perfect union? And if so, then Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, we can start the conversation there about where you should be on public land. I therefore, and I say this as someone who grew up on Missionary Ridge, a Civil War battlefield in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I do not believe that any Confederate officer or official should be on public land in the United States, because they attempted to undo the constitutional experiment that would not have produced the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so I don't care what you do in your house. I don't care what you do schools. That's for you all to decide. But if it's public space, I believe that the first question has to be, for commemoration, were you part of this journey?
Annette.
I have to answer?
Well, only if you want to.
Oh, no, Jefferson, you got to put a list of things.
Well, right. Should
You gotta put a
Jefferson be on
list
the
of
$2 bill?
Well, nobody should be on the $2 bill. There shouldn't be a $2 bill. It should be a $2 coin. For Jackson is problematic because he definitely did advance the experiment and expanding democracy.
There's
and
a
so
but
forth.
coming.
But the whole phenomenon, and he didn't cause this, but Jacksonianism was the advancement of the rights of white men, but the retraction of rights of black people. During the Jacksonian era, places where black people could vote, the vote was taken away, and it was a white man's government. That's what he represented. And so that's kind of problematic for me. I don't mind a statue of him somewhere. The currency, we could have someone else on the currency.
That's fine.
That's for me.
Fine.
I mean, that's it. I mean, he's a more problematic figure to me.
The European Union doesn't have people on currency because they despair of arguments like this.
Oh, yeah, because
You
they've been
can't get
fighting each other.
France
They've been
and Germany
fighting
to
1,000
agree,
years.
So they just have waterfalls and bridges.
Wonderful, the bridges.
And you could have, why not have lots of people? Why isn't Frederick Douglass on currency? Why isn't Harriet Tubman? Why? I mean, there are any number of ways to do this. But I must say, we're living, if I may, we're sitting here with an unfolding constitutional crisis in this country.
Yep.
And so I don't care who's on the currency.
Yeah.
What I care about is that a huge chunk of this country is willing to violate the rule of law out of a devotion to a person and a party that has allowed itself to become a vehicle for this person who puts the will to power above the common good. That's where we are. And it's not, this is not a drill, right? I know we're in Aspen, so we're supposed to think big thoughts, and that is the biggest of thoughts.
Oh, yeah.
This was going to be my last
I agree with
question.
you on that. It's the currency, those things are trivial compared to where we are right now.
Well, there are people who get animated by
But they have too much
currency
time on
debate
their
or
hands.
Pardon me?
I really do believe, I mean, fine, take him off the currency. We're dealing with, I want to know whose picture's on the nuclear secrets that are down in Florida. I mean, what?
Yeah.
That's what I want to know.
Well, I'll get to my last question now, since you've introduced it. Are we on the verge of another American Civil War?
I'll defer to my colleague from Harvard.
We're on the verge of something, not like, because it's not a regional thing. It's not regional. You go up to Maine, you go up to, from Texas to Maine, there's polarization among the people in these groups. So you wouldn't be able to, there's no Mason-Dixon line that you could draw and find. We seem to be, and I hope it's not true, I hope it doesn't continue, I could see violence, individual acts of violence in different regions and different parts. We're not going to, swear off with, I think, with soldiers, but that kind of violence that's politically motivated, we seem to be headed towards that. We may be in it, and it may escalate. I hope it doesn't. We don't seem to have people on, you would need people on both sides. We keep talking about this in terms of sides, but both sides of the aisle, leaders to say, hey, come on, we can have our disagreements, but we can't do this. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing it being stoked by people. So, I like to be optimistic, and I always try to do that, but I'm not at this particular moment. This has been an amazing week and an amazing period, and I just don't know where we're going to go from here.
I don't think there's any question that this is American democracy's, which is not pure democracy as we know, but it's American democracy's hour of maximum danger. More so than 1933, when FDR said the two most dangerous men in America are Huey Long and Douglas MacArthur, because he feared they could lead a populist revolt from the left or the right. That was perspective. We have someone who's leading a populist revolt from the right. And democracy requires the kinds of things we're doing right now, right? It's about seeing each other not as reflexive adversaries, but as neighbors. And you don't have to love your neighbor as yourself. If everybody did, Jesus wouldn't have thought to command it, right? You don't say, you don't offer a commandment if everybody's doing it. So it only works if we stay in this constitutional conversation, even when we lose. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And it didn't work in the 1850s because the election of Abraham Lincoln was seen as a fatal blow to the white supremacist slave-owning interest. Far be it for me to ever add anything to what Annette said, but it is, the Mason-Dixon line actually mattered a little bit less than we think because of the Copperhead interest, right? I mean, the direct slave owners were the engine of secession, but you had an enormous, Lincoln called it the fire in the rear. He had a white supremacist interest in the North and the West that was, it complicated his task immensely. And it did take 750,000 people dying before we resolved that. And so I don't think armed conflict in the way that Annette's talking about it is going to happen. But I also would not have sat here in 2016 or even 2017 or 2018 and maybe even 19, and maybe even into the summer of 20, and said a significant number of Americans are not going to disagree about policy. They're going to disagree about whether an election is real. And when you deny reality, it's the slipperiest of slopes. And that's the task that faces all of us. And President Biden thinks about it all the time. We have to think about it all the time.
And if you don't, and if you think that something was illegitimate, what you do is you go to the courts, and that's what happened over and over, and the court spoke, and then that should be it. Even if you're upset, the answer is a political answer. It is, we'll get them next time. We'll go vote, and we'll vote them out. That's what you do. But if you don't accept that, then you don't have a republic. You don't have a democracy.
I'm glad you mentioned the court, because there have also been voices. I don't weight them on equally on a scale, but there have been voices that have been raised in response to recent Supreme Court decisions that don't want to follow that law, that consider it to be counterfeit, the result of a generation-long political battle to capture the Supreme Court of the United States. They don't view it as real decisions, and they don't want to live in that country.
Well, yeah, but the answer from the side who's saying that I've seen would be to use the political power, the power that's there in the Constitution, to change the court. You know, I mean, concerned about the appointment of the last three, holding out, you know, denying Garland his place for a year. You know, not because he was unqualified, but in order to gambling that you'll get another president. In other words, making, and this isn't the court's fault, it's, but making it more a political process than people like to, we sort of imagine that it's not. We know that it is, but this was sort of a rank political thing.
I mean, the whole idea used to be, right, that the court was above politics, and just because somebody had been, had hewed one way or another, the whole idea of a lifetime appointment was that they were free to dispute with. I mean, Hugo Black had been in the Ku Klux Klan.
Blackman, other people changed. They made, you know, they voted on the basis of their consciousness, you know, not necessarily who appointed them. I guess what I'm getting at is that there has been a reaction against the court's ruling, but even before then, people were thinking court reform. Well, the court has been reformed periodically. We went from 6 to 3 to 6, and then to 10, and then 9 when there are 9 circuits. They had 9. We got 13 circuits now and only 9 justices. So what I'm getting at is I think one side is still trying to operate within the confines of the system, but there are other calls, you know, other calls that are sort of extra legal, and that's when you have the kind of problem that Jon has identified.
Perfectly reasonable and as ever eloquently put. Do you read phone books too? This is really good. Do y'all know what Cameo is? It's an app where you can order celebrities. So Scott Simon's just going to read your phone book for you with that great voice. But I couldn't disagree more with the premise of the question. When the Dobbs decision was handed down, nobody stormed the Supreme Court, did they? They might have tweeted, they might have pounded on the table, because that's what we do in the United States of America. You don't team up with white supremacist anti-government groups and try to kill the Speaker of the House and kill police officers because someone's doing their constitutional duty. This is not equivalent. It is not both sides.
I think I said tomorrow. I didn't put it on.
No, I'm not talking. No, but this is a prevalent argument.
But I bet. Let me interrupt a bit with my indifferent voice. I'm under no illusions who listens to me on the air. And they probably weren't at the Capitol January 6th, except unless they were employees or they were...
Or covering it.
Yeah, or covering it. Is that? But on the other hand, I hear from people every day on social media platforms that don't want to live in this country that they believe is ruled by pernicious and evil interests. And I don't use those terms grandiloquently. They will say pernicious and evil, and they believe there's been a generations-long attempt to gain power, and they don't want to consider it dishonest, and they don't want to live there. And more to the point, they don't want to hear them interviewed on our air. They don't want to hear anybody with a contrary viewpoint.
Yeah.
They say we're wasting airspace if we put somebody on the air who disputes what they think.
Yeah.
And I don't mind telling you, I don't weigh it on the same scale, but it also alarms me, because if we're going to have a democracy, that we have to speak to everybody.
So yes, absolutely. And you've put your finger on a potential problem. We have a real problem with the evidence of our eyes, okay? And that is not to say that what Scott is laying out is not a threat. The center and the left right now in American politics, and even the center right to some extent, are being asked to be like the father in the prodigal son. Mm-hmm. They're asked to be immensely patient, forgiving, forbearing.
I hate that story, but go ahead. We'll have to argue about that afterwards.
The prodigal son?
The prodigal son story. This is a running it's an argument in my family.
I didn't write it.
I know.
You get these.
Now,
you get these.
There was a bestseller.
You get these. These.
Yeah.
Annette's from Texas, so we'll get into it. If it weren't for Tennesseans, they'd still be part of Spain. So.
Is that is that so bad?
I made that crack to George W. Bush once. He went, "That's pretty funny, asshole." So the center and the left are being asked to be patient, forbearing, forgiving, right? And if they fall off this constitutional conversation or opt out of it totally, then we're done. Yeah. Then we're done. And I think that one of the things that I worry about all the time is my oldest child is 20. The students we teach were all now basically born after September 11th, if you want to feel particularly old. Think about the last quarter century. If your lived experience as an American, what's your lived experience? September 11th, the intelligence failures with Iraq, the financial crisis of 2008, Donald Trump, insurrection, and COVID. So what in your lived experience makes you think that the public sector can in fact be and the climate gets progressively worse, right? Mm-hmm. So it puts an immense political burden, and I would say this goes back to what we were talking about history. It puts a huge burden, I think, on if you believe that this constitutional structure is the best of all, the best of a bad deal, which is, I think, not a bad way to put it, then you have to tell a story about its working. Because there's not as much evidence in people's real lives that it is. And that's what Scott's listeners tell him from one side and what we see in the streets on the other.
Yeah, yeah. And people who want to move, people who, friends who've talked about leaving the country and moving.
Yes, my wife is French, as a lot of people know, and I guess, oh, what the hell, you mentioned it? Yes, of course, we've talked about that. Mm-hmm. But of course, France has its own problems.
Yeah, but the difference is you would be floating above that as not you don't feel the same, maybe your wife might, but the same connection to it.
And as you know, our children are Asian, and that means something different in France, at least at the moment. President Obama notably quoted Dr. Martin Luther King in saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards progress. With respect for both Dr. King and President Obama, is that true? What do you think at this moment?
You have to bend it. You have to work. It doesn't bend naturally. It's never bended naturally. It happens because people push. And you have to fight for the things that you think are important and that matter. And I don't think that this is going to be resolved unless people in school boards who don't like the idea of banning books come out and say, you know, to sort of push back against a lot of the things that are happening. History doesn't have an end. You know, everybody says that the history doesn't have a side. When people, you know, it sort of annoys me when people are, and I say it too, on the right side of history, as if there is a right side. History doesn't have a side. It just happens. Things unfold. And depending upon what happens in the next year or so, 50 years from now, people might look back at this and say, this was a golden age. This was the beginning of a new America. You know, moving that little, you know, democracy stuff out of the way, and we've evolved into a new thing. You know, we can't know what's going to happen and how this will all turn out. But to answer your question, as I started, to say it bends if you bend it, if you work at it.
The origin of the quotation is from Theodore Parker, the New England abolitionist and racist, like many abolitionists were, who said, "Look at the facts of the world. I cannot see but a little ways. My eyes cannot go that far, but I can divine it by conscience. The arc of a moral universe is long, but I believe it bends toward justice." Dr. King improved on it, as he tended to do, and used it in his final Sunday sermon on March 31st, 1968 at the Washington National Cathedral, in which he also said, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the way God's universe is made. That's the way it is structured." Never a better description of the democratic, lowercase d, covenant about love of neighbor. I can't agree more with Annette. The arc of a moral universe bends when there are people insisting that it swerve. And, for instance, John Robert Lewis insisted that it swerve. And he was part of a dialectic of history, which people like me don't pay enough attention, to go to Scott's first good question. We don't pay enough attention, not Annette, but this is a sin I commit. We tend to exaggerate the influence of the great person. But Lyndon Johnson would not have been great if John Lewis hadn't been willing to die, and if people hadn't died. So this just came to me this week on a different subject. I do this daily podcast. If you're at Guantanamo, they play it for you. It's like, God, no, let me go. And it's the anniversary this coming week of James Meredith graduating from the University of Mississippi. We always think about the crisis, but we don't think about what happened. Well, he graduated with a degree in political science from the University of Mississippi in 1963. First time a black person was granted a degree from the University of Mississippi, 1963, the day before yesterday. And in doing it, I naturally went to look at President Kennedy gave an amazing speech in September 1962 about this, about the rule of law. I commend it to you. It's on the Google machine. And it's about, without the rule of law, no one can be sure of their property, no judge can be sure of his writ, no neighbor can be sure of his safety in terms of another, without the rule of law. James Meredith made that speech possible. And so I go back to this. This is an incredible hour for citizenship, and for what Robert Kennedy later called ripples of hope.
I put that question down, and let me share a little bit of the thinking behind it. And I think you touched on it when you were talking about people who were born after 2000. I had a sense, growing up when I did, in post-World War II era, my father had been in as a matter of fact, the British Army. I had a sense that the moral arc of the universe was bending toward progress. There had been terrible racism and anti-Semitism in the United States. The United States had been asleep while Jews were put in camps and all over Europe, and France capitulated. But we stormed the beaches of Normandy, we won. Harry S. Truman integrated the U.S. military. Jackie Robinson became a Major League Baseball player. President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock to enforce the law that integrated schools. We could go on. There were steps, there were reverses. The Civil Rights Movement. Lyndon Johnson saying before the U.S. Congress, "We shall overcome." There was a confidence that yes, there were setbacks and there were reverses, but we would overcome, that the moral arc of the universe was bending toward progress. Can we say that now?
Well, you have to realize if those things that were exciting you were repelling other people. Mm-hmm. They didn't see it as progress. They saw it as degradation. And what you have going on now for some people is restoration, a sense of trying to bring things back to where they should have been. Because I had the same feeling as well, growing up, thinking, yes, that this was going to be progress and that we're heading somewhere. But there were always people who resisted that. And beginning it really in the 80s and sort of a backlash against the civil rights movement and some of the outcomes with that, there are people who see themselves as part of a renaissance now, don't you? I mean, it's hard to imagine that, but there may be optimism from that side, and it just means we're going to have the kind of engaged citizenship that you're talking about to try to resolve this.
Yeah, I guess I would offer this. It didn't take until the 80s for there to be a backlash. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite example of this is, so after a 67-day filibuster, the 1964 Civil Rights Act is signed, and Lyndon Johnson immediately goes about keeping an integrated delegation from coming to the Atlantic City Democratic National Convention. 20 minutes later, we have the tapes because he feared Barry Goldwater. We now know Goldwater carried 5 states, but he didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And he feared a phrase that had just entered the vernacular called backlash. Look that up. It came out in the summer of 1964. John Lewis said that the most depressing thing, the 2 most depressing moments during the civil rights movement for him before King's assassination, one was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in September 1963, the death of 4 young women, and Lyndon Johnson refusing to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at Atlantic City in 1964 because the Civil Rights Act signed in July had suggested that the battle had been won. And in Lyndon Johnson, who courageously pursued civil rights in an election year, who said wonderfully, what the hell is the presidency for, if not to do the things that other men might not do? But, as Annette has written beautifully, he was a human being. He was sinful. He was fallen. He was frail. He was fallible, as are, well, I am and Scott is, Annette is not. I'm going to drag you into that. So, what do you expect? What do we? There's no. This is not a fairy tale. There's never a once upon a time in American history. There's not going to be a happily ever after because it's a human undertaking. And we are flawed. And that, I'm not saying, therefore, you adjust your expectations or you put up with injustice or you don't try to bend the arc. But let's be clear-eyed about this. I am a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian, right? Things work out for me in this country. I'm fine. But part of that is to whom much is given, much is expected. And just enough Americans along the way have believed that.
We have left time for your questions too, and I want to make certain we have enough time. I think there are microphones that are going to circulate in the crowd, right? If I'm, okay, thank you. I can't think of any better system than to ask you all to raise your hands. No, wait. Download the app. Text us your question. Password has to have 9 letters, 2 symbols.
Special character.
Yeah, special characters. Yeah, and don't use nicknames of pets or something like that.
I will give anybody $5 who says long-time listener, first-time caller. And where are my Ken Burns DVDs?
Oh yes, yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Good. Okay, John.
Yes, ma'am.
Yesterday you quoted MSNBC. You on MSNBC?
Let's not actually quote anything I've said.
No.
That's a little unfair.
You said on NBC, you quoted Mark Twain's remark that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
So what is the Petri dish here? Looking at our current disturbing state of affairs from a historical perspective, what's the Petri dish? Where do you think this dark, reality-denying, conspiratorial, cultish, dangerous tendency in American consciousness has come from? It certainly could not have come from President Trump alone. So what started all this? That's what I have never been able to understand.
Yeah. So I can tell that you're on the fence about things. This is I'll be happy to answer, but if you want to just get the quick answer, Google up, as we say, Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics. It was the cover story in Harper's, October 1964. It was about the John Birchers, but you could just change the names right now. It's a human thing, right? Human beings are susceptible to conspiracy theory. They're susceptible to narratives that explain everything. It's like remember the Kasabian's title for the book in Middlemarch was going to be A Key to All Mythologies, right? People there's a human impulse to have a key to all mythologies. And if you have actually suffered loss or fear loss, Hofstadter in another essay, which actually Hofstadter is really annoying because he said everything that any of us could say, and he's long dead. But he talked about the difference between interest politics and status politics. When politics are about interest, you can compromise. My tax rate, your bridges, whatever. That's a coherent conversation. When it becomes about your status, racial, gender, social, then you are on a quick path to a kind of Hobbesian total war. And I think Trump exacerbated it. He certainly didn't create it. Elaine Pagels is here. She's written about what created it, and that's the Garden of Eden. Right? This is as ancient as it gets. I'm Elaine Pagels' super fan. And so this is about human nature. And again, I think theologically sometimes too much, but this is about sin, which is called, in the origin of the word sin, is to miss the mark. And I think all of us kind of wake up in the morning and think, well, I want to hit the mark, and then by my second sip of coffee, I've screwed up. But you have to want to wake up and want to do the right thing. And I think right now what we're seeing is that there's less and less, to go to Annette's point, narratively enforced incentive to not miss the mark. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, we have. It's kind of like a quiz show, isn't it? They run down to the audience with the microphone.
Great.
Yeah.
I thought they're going to pull me up on stage.
Yeah.
You've made allusions to will the grand American experiment survive this moment, which is certainly an open question. Comment on how we proactively change the grand American experiment, meaning Supreme Court justices were appointed for life when life expectancy was 50, not 85, right? Strict constructionism did not anticipate artificial intelligence. 1/3 of the population controls 2/3 of the Senate. None of that was envisioned, and yet we sort of hang on the foundational where this all came from. How do we get more proactive about what we want to look forward 100 years and 200 years instead of trying to preserve what came from the past?
Let me ask both of you to.
Let me just like,
Yeah, because you were talking.
I want to be. I want to be clear. I'm not for restoring something. I don't think because it wasn't that great, right? Again, I'm a white guy, so you can restore what you want, and I'm going to be fine. But that's not what we should do. This is not about getting back to something. It's about seeking to discern by the lights of reason and conscience, whether that comes from a religious or a morally secular, whatever it is, a path that makes more real the most important sentence, I would argue, ever originally rendered in English, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. I am careful about, that's a hyperbolic claim about the most important. It always reminds me of Annette's home state. The Texas gubernatorial candidate who was against teaching Spanish in the public schools and said on the stump one day, if English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for Texas. But, so how that sounded in the original Aramaic, I don't know. But I would say this, the kinds of constitutional reform you're talking about are vital, is vital. Joe Biden won a perfectly respectable popular vote, more than Truman, more than Kennedy. I could bore you with that. But right now, let's stabilize the patient. Let's enforce the rule of law. And if we want to start calling constitutional conventions, that's great. We can't get 52% of Americans to agree on anything. So I think this is one step at a time. But you're absolutely right.
No, I would agree with that. I ask my students very often about a constitutional convention. Of course, never. They don't want it because they don't trust Americans. They don't trust other people. So as far as the court reform, I think one thing we could do is to do what I suggested before, is that people have to be involved. Citizens have to be involved in a democracy. That's the idea, the democratic republic. You're supposed to be a part of it and to make your feelings known and come out and run for office and go to the local school board and pay attention to state elections, do all those kinds of things. I think if we were to get involved civically, civic engagement, I think would be the first step, would be one of the ways of correcting, sort of saving the patient in a way. A convention we need, the Constitution is an 18th century document that doesn't fit the moment that we're in. And as we saw in the Dobbs opinion, where the interpretation is basically the rights that women have are the rights that they had in 1789, which were none, under coverture, married women. I mean, so something needs to be done about that. But this is not the right moment. This is to call a convention and to fix all of these things. But I think that there are other steps that could be taken, participation by citizens, maybe some kind of Supreme Court reform. Some people say term limits. I mean, I would like to see the court. I'd like to see the court expanded. I know the president is probably not going to want to do that. It's not his call, but he would not be in favor of that. But if that would be 13 circuits, 13 justices for it. And there's something strange about the idea that we've had such a huge increase in population and so forth. And it's like we're scared to touch any of these mechanisms, and they're there. The Congress can control this. It could alter the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It could do all these things. Nothing should be thought of as set in stone.
This is overly facile, but it's me, so that's what I'm doing. There was an interesting debate in the 1850s about which document should have primacy. Is it the Declaration or the Constitution? And Lincoln came down 7 years ago was not 1787. Mm-hmm. I think it's worth thinking about. Are you a Declaration American or a Constitution American first?
We have some, yes, sir.
I'm a World War II veteran. Oh, I'm a World War II veteran. Okay. Thank you for the applause. I didn't say that for the applause. I happen to be 98 years old also.
God bless.
I'd like to depart from the Constitution for a moment. I'm also a former Supreme Court Justice of New York. But aside from that, may I ask the historians, when history is going to be looked upon, what will historians say about the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that actually brought World War II with Japan to an end? What is your take on that, John? And what is your take on that, Annette?
So our friend Evan Thomas has just written a book about this that's coming out next year about Henry Stimson and Truman, and to what extent there was a moral debate about it in real time. That's why the book is short, because there wasn't much of one. It was seen as a incredibly powerful weapon, but it was being dropped because of what had happened on Okinawa, what the Japanese resilience and refusal to surrender. There was never a moment. I find this fascinating. We all kind of want, don't we, to think that Truman was sitting at his desk and George Marshall was on one side and Atchison was there and they were debating what to do. It never happened. There was a kind of bureaucratic force to it. They spent a lot of money on it. They knew it was incredibly powerful. Oppenheimer knew that. But there was some murkiness about the extent to which it would alter reality itself. And so I think were you in the Pacific? Yes. So would you have been part of the invasion of the home islands?
I was in the Philippines.
Okay. So you might not be here if you hadn't dropped the bomb.
I was going to be in the first attack wave.
Okay.
On Japan. Japan had 400,000 waiting for us with kamikazes. And of course, we have that difference in our country that takes the position that we should not have dropped the bomb because it was a barbaric thing to do. And of course, it was a barbaric thing to do. But on the other hand, if we didn't do that, we would have lost 1 million American soldiers. How does history look upon that? And how does history say, what should we have done that would have been appropriate?
Well, I mean, that's
correct.
This goes back to what I was saying before about history. It depends upon the era. I mean, before it was never questioned. I mean, it was always questioned, but I would say the general consensus was that this was something that was needed. And then we come to a point where people do begin to question it. So what I'm getting at is I don't think there will be one answer, because every generation of people asks different questions about the moment.
But won't history really decide that 25, 50 years from now?
It'll decide it, and then they'll decide it again.
Yeah.
And that's why people, you talked about living in the 25-year schedule and then living in the moment. The decision was being made in real time, and they're thinking about you and other soldiers and where they were at that moment. History will be out of that moment, and people will be thinking about it in a different way. So it will change depending upon the generation.
Harry Truman always said he would have been impeached if he hadn't authorized the use of the bomb. We have done many interviews about it and talked to people over the years, and I think Annette's point, if I may, is very good. We can take 25, 30, 50, we can take a century to decide if it was a good decision or not, but there were people who had to make the decision at that particular time with lives in their hands. Thank you, by the way, very much for...
Well, thank you for the response. Thank you, John. Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Could we, I know we have some hands in the back. I haven't seen anyone nodding off. There's a man with his hand in the back.
Annette, this question is for you, and I'm wondering, as a black woman in this America, what gives you reason for hope at this moment in time?
Well, young people who are people like my daughters, people in my daughter's generation, who were really galvanized by 2016, and some of her friends, one of her friends ran for office and won in New York, and she's been involved in all kinds of campaigns. She went down to Texas to be on to work on Beto's campaign, his first campaign. I think it's young people, my students, who all want to do stuff. They're really interested in making a difference. And it's not, I mean, they're interested in their careers, but they're always asking about other kinds of things that they can be doing. That is what gives me hope, is that that people recognize that there's a problem and that there's problems to be solved. And the generation, my daughter's generation and my daughter and son, they're out there. And so I have a feeling that they're gonna make a difference.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
This has been very interesting. Your conversation was supporting a lot of the things that we believe and think of. We're all very upset about what's going on in the country right now. But if Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson were sitting where you guys are sitting right now, they would be telling us a completely different story. And that story is being told to a lot of people. And they're getting to make a lot of money telling that story. Can we stop that?
No. Would you still be here if they were talking? Seriously. Would you have come to see Tucker and who else?
I would, because
okay.
I'd like to hear what the other
Good. That's the answer, if I may. Yes. No, you can't, and you shouldn't. You can't be for democracy only when you agree with the other person.
But they're telling you, they're not telling you.
But I mean, but there's the difficulty here, and we were talking a little bit about this before, is, you can't, the thing that strikes me about today is that there's a completely different kind of reality created. And it's not like a difference of opinion. It's, another universe. And that's the thing that I don't see how we're, I'm saying people should be civically engaged in all of this, but we have to, at some level, be able to agree on facts or certain realities, and we're not there.
Well, we kind of do. I mean, yes, ideally, but we haven't agreed on the definition of a person for 200 years, right? I don't need to tell you that. I mean, we had to fight a civil war over whether we would enslave other people because of the accident of the color of their skin. So I think they're all. I think that's an active force, an illiberal force. I really do. But at the same time, I don't think, I've been talking about this. There's a difference, isn't there? And I submit it to you. I haven't come to quite the answer yet. There's a difference between convincing someone and persuading them. Does that make sense? Because most people don't want to be convinced, right? They want their views to be affirmed. And I know that the people who are in the arena now, the political people, have a very complicated task, because they have to, who's going to listen to someone who says, you are wrong, you are living in an alternate universe, and you do not have the facts, and here's my pitch. It's not, there has to be some common vernacular. And I know, believe me, I'm largely with you, but I think that the notion of censoring speech is letting the other side win.
The fairness doctrine?
Fairness. Well, I actually started reading about that. It's a lot more complicated. We'll talk about it.
Fairness doctrine is gone.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure, it is
Wouldn't have affected cable news. It affected radio.
Yeah, broadcasting. We have ended absolutely on time. And we could go on for some time, but I think what we've heard tonight has filled us with a lot to think about and reflect upon. And I just want to say what a great honor it has been to hear Jon Meacham and Annette Gordon read. And thank you to the nice folks at the Aspen Institute for making this possible. Congratulations on this distinguished award, which you share with so many distinguished people. And in any event, thank you for making our nights. Thanks for being with us. Thank you.